Hey guys, tonight we are going to travel back in time. Close your eyes for a moment. You're standing on a creaky wooden dock. The air smells of salt tar and something else, something unknown. It's the year 1550. The world feels vast, mysterious, and frankly, a little terrifying. Beyond the familiar coastlines, the maps become less about geography and more about imagination guesswork and the occasional sea monster doing a backstroke. You might set sail with a map promising a quick route to untold riches, only to find yourself staring at an endless, empty ocean that simply isn't there on your carefully drawn parchment. You probably won't survive this journey if you rely only on what's written down. It's a dangerous game driven by dreams and depicted on maps that were, let's just say, aspirational. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening live or drifting off somewhere specific, let me know your location and the local time in the comments. It's cool to see where these stories reach. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the rough wood beneath your feet, the cry of gulls overhead. The ship is ready, sails furled tight against the mast. You've signed up for an expedition lured by tales of golden cities and spices worth more than their weight in silver. Your most prized possession? A map. Not just any map, but a new one, recently printed, rumored to show the way. You unfurl it carefully. It's not like the clean satellite-verified maps you're used to. This is a work of art as much as information. Vibrant colors, intricate calligraphy, and margins adorned with fantastical beasts. The coastlines you recognize are there, but beyond them, things get interesting. See that shape over there, that massive landmass labeled America? It's huge on this map, stretching north and south, but the details inland are sparse, often just sketches of mountains, rivers that might or might not exist, and placeholder text like, "Here be gold," or "Fierce tribes." The scale feels off. Everything feels off compared to what you know. Africa is recognizably Africa, but maybe a bit squat. Asia sprawls enigmatically, its eastern reaches dissolving into guesswork. And the oceans, the oceans. They dominate this map, vast stretches of blue or green vellum dotted with ships' compass roses and those aforementioned slightly too cheerful sea monsters. This map isn't just a tool, it's a window into a world where knowledge abruptly ended at the horizon. Imagine trying to navigate across an ocean you only partially understand towards a continent whose shape is still being debated by cartographers back in Europe. These map makers weren't being deliberately deceptive, not usually. They were working with the best information they had, which was often fragments of explorer logs, sailors' tales, and outright rumors. If a sailor swore he saw a giant serpent off the coast of Brazil, well into the margin, that serpent might go just in case. It was a blend of empirical observation, navigators measuring latitudes, rough longitudes based on dead reckoning, and pure unadulterated speculation. Think of it like trying to map your messy bedroom blindfolded. You know the big furniture is there, but the exact location of that missing sock, total mystery. In the 1500s, the age of exploration was in full swing, fueled by a potent cocktail of greed, curiosity, religious fervor, and technological advancements like the astrolabe and improved ship design. But the biggest driver, the thing that pointed the way, or the supposed way, were these maps. Owning a good or even a promising map was like owning a potential lottery ticket. It could point you towards new trading partners, untapped resources, or a quicker, safer route to already established riches. The information on a map wasn't just lines and names. It was economic potential, geopolitical power, and sometimes the difference between life and a watery grave. For centuries before this, European maps were heavily influenced by Ptolemy, an ancient Greek scholar whose geography was remarkably accurate for the parts of the world he knew, but wildly off for the rest. He envisioned a much smaller Earth, and crucially, he didn't know the Americas existed. Even as explorers began bumping into new land masses in the late 1400s and early 1500s, mapmakers struggled to integrate this new information. How big was this new world? Was it connected to Asia? Was it one continent or many islands? The maps from this transitional period are fascinatingly messy, showing continents shrinking, growing, moving, and sometimes simply disappearing based on the latest, often contradictory reports filtering back to Europe. One mainstream historical fact from this era is the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Spain and Portugal, the two dominant naval powers at the time, drew an imaginary line down the Atlantic. Everything discovered west of the line belonged to Spain, and everything east belonged to Portugal. This was decided based on incredibly shaky geographic knowledge and a desire to avoid conflict, carving up a world they hadn't even fully mapped yet. Imagine drawing a line through your neighbor's yard and claiming half of it before you've even seen what's on the other side of the fence. Peak 1500s energy right there. A quirkier tidbit. Some maps of this period actually depicted California as an island. This wasn't based on exploration, but largely on a popular Spanish romance novel from 1510 that described a mythical island of Amazons ruled by Queen Califia, rich in gold, on the right hand of the Indies. Explorers finding a peninsula might have latched onto this idea, perhaps seeing wishful thinking solidify into cartographic fact for a time. It shows how easily myth and fantasy could bleed onto the page, especially when accurate information was scarce. You wanted California to be a rich island paradise. Poof, your next map might just make it so. Historians still argue whether the flawed maps of the 1500s were primarily a result of genuine ignorance, deliberate attempts to mislead rivals, or a combination of both. Some maps might have intentionally exaggerated the size of certain land claims or omitted potential dangers to encourage funding for expeditions. Others were simply the best possible synthesis of limited, often inaccurate data from explorers who might not have been skilled navigators, might have exaggerated their findings, or were simply working under impossible conditions. It's tricky to untangle intent from incompetence 5 centuries later. As you trace your finger over the map, you can almost feel the hopes and fears poured into its creation. Every blank space is a question mark, every coastline a promise or a potential trap. The sheer act of committing these guesses and fragments of knowledge to parchment transformed them, giving them a weight and authority they perhaps didn't deserve. And it was this authority, this belief in the map, that would drive ships into uncharted waters, towards promised lands that might not exist, and into the waiting maw of oceans far larger and far emptier than anyone could have imagined. The journey begins not on the ship, but here on this flawed, beautiful, maddening piece of paper. As you hold that map, feeling its texture, noticing the slightly raised lines of the ink you're holding, something rooted deeply in history, yet straining to capture a future that's unfolding faster than the cartographers can draw. Before this age, the maps guiding sailors, particularly in the Mediterranean and along European coasts, were often something called portaland charts. Think of these as the GPS systems of their day, but strictly for coastal hopping. They were incredibly practical, featuring lines radiating from compass roses, showing directions and detailed coastlines, with harbors and landmarks based on real-world observation and magnetic compass readings. They weren't trying to show the whole world, just the bits you needed to sail near land without hitting rocks. They were functional, often beautiful, and surprisingly accurate for the areas they covered. But the maps aiming to show the whole known world, the ones trying to capture the grand sweep of continents and oceans, for over 1,000 years, these were utterly dominated by the work of one man, Claudius Ptolemy, a Greco-Egyptian scholar who lived in Alexandria in the 2nd century AD. His massive work, Geographia, was a mind-boggling achievement for its time. Ptolemy compiled existing knowledge about the world's geography, described how to make maps using a coordinate system, a precursor to latitude and longitude based on degrees, and listed thousands of locations with their coordinates. Now imagine getting your hands on that book. It was lost to Western Europe for centuries, preserved and expanded upon in the Islamic world before being rediscovered and translated into Latin in the early 15th century. For European scholars and mapmakers, it was like finding the ultimate cheat sheet. Suddenly, they had a theoretical framework for mapping the entire globe, a way to place everything relative to everything else using a mathematical system. It was revolutionary. It allowed them to create maps that looked, well, global. They could draw continents and oceans based on his tables of coordinates, filling in the details from classical texts and traveler accounts. The problem: Ptolemy was working with limited data. He knew Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia reasonably well, though his scale and positions weren't perfect. But he had no clue about the Americas or Australia, and his understanding of the size of the Earth was significantly smaller than it actually is. He also depicted the Indian Ocean as landlocked, surrounded by continents, which is a pretty major error if you're trying to find a sea route to Asia. So for the first few decades of the 1500s, mapmakers were in a fascinating, slightly absurd situation. They had this ancient, highly respected blueprint from Ptolemy, which felt mathematically solid, but explorers were coming back saying things like, "Hey, about that ocean you said was landlocked, turns out you can sail around Africa." Or more dramatically, boss, there's this huge landmass, right where Ptolemy's map said there should just be ocean leading straight to Asia. This influx of actual data from voyages of discovery, tales of encountering entirely new coastlines of sailing for weeks across an ocean that Ptolemy's map didn't account for, of finding lands populated by people no ancient text had ever mentioned, started to poke serious holes in the Ptolemaic model. It wasn't like they threw Ptolemy out overnight. His coordinate system was still incredibly useful, and mapmakers tried desperately to integrate the new information onto the old framework. Imagine trying to update a very old operating system by just pasting screenshots of new apps onto the desktop. That's a bit what it was like. Early maps of the 1500s based on Ptolemy are often called Ptolemaic maps, even as they started showing the faint outlines of a new continent across the Atlantic. They tried to cram the Americas into the existing structure, distorting scales and shapes to make it fit, or sometimes depicting it as a series of islands off the coast of Asia, holding on to the hope that Columbus had actually found the Indies. One mainstream historical fact illustrating this transition is Martin Balsimuller's map of 1507. This map is famous for being the first to label the new landmass America after Amerigo Vespucci, who had correctly argued it was a separate continent, not part of Asia. However, even this groundbreaking map still incorporated many Ptolemaic elements and struggled with the correct size and shape of the new lands. It was a bold step, but still a foot planted firmly in the past while reaching tentatively toward the future. Think of it as the cartographic equivalent of wearing a powdered wig with a t-shirt, a slightly awkward blend of eras. A quirky tidbit about these transitional maps. Some early 16th century world maps tried to reconcile the existence of the Americas by drastically shrinking the size of the Pacific Ocean, making it seem like Asia was just a short hop from the new continent. This was partly based on Ptolemy's underestimated Earth's circumference, and partly on wishful thinking. A short ocean crossing to the riches of the East was the whole point, right? These maps essentially created a vast, non-existent, empty quarter in the Pacific to make the numbers work, which, spoiler alert, is not ideal for navigation. Sailing off the edge of that Kadat map might not mean falling into space, but it definitely meant sailing into an awful lot more ocean than you bargained for. Historians still argue whether the rapid pace of discovery in the early 1500s was primarily a result of technological advancement, finally catching up to ambition, or if the explorers were simply incredibly lucky to stumble upon a new world that fundamentally broke the old geographic models, forcing a paradigm shift in mapmaking and understanding. Was it the ships and instruments, or the sheer disruptive force of encountering something entirely unexpected that truly drove this change? It's like debating if your messy room got that way because you're lazy or because a portal to another dimension occasionally spits dirty socks into it. Probably a bit of both, but the portal definitely changes the game. As the century wore on, the weight of contradictory evidence became too much for the purely Ptolemaic view to bear. Mapmakers began to rely less on the ancient coordinates and more on the messy, imperfect, but real data coming back from voyages. They started to incorporate the bulbous shape of South America, the long coast of North America stretching further north than imagined, and the vastness of the oceans separating these lands from Europe and Asia. It was a slow, iterative process, each new voyage adding another puzzle piece, often one that didn't quite fit with the pieces already on the table. The map in your hand reflects this struggle. A world partially revealed, still bound by old assumptions, yet flickering with the first light of new disruptive knowledge. It's a portrait of geographical uncertainty, painted with ink and ambition. The map you're holding is a snapshot of a world in flux, a world where the ancient blueprints were crumbling under the weight of fresh, often chaotic information. Imagine being a cartographer in the early 1500s. Your job title sounds fancy. Maybe you have a nice quill pen and a room with lots of rolled up charts. But in reality, you're likely squinting at scribbled notes from sailors who've just returned from voyages lasting months or years. They give you rough bearings as estimates of distance that might be wildly off depending on currents and weather, and maybe a hasty sketch of a coastline seen through spray and fatigue. This wasn't like getting precise GPS coordinates or satellite imagery, obviously. It was like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle of an elephant based only on descriptions from 10 blindfolded people touching different parts of it. One says it's wrinkly and flat, the ear. Another says it's thick and cylindrical. The legs, someone else mentions something long and flexible, the trunk. Now draw the whole elephant based on that. The pressure was immense. Everyone wanted updated maps. Merchants needed them for trade routes, rulers needed them to claim new lands, and explorers needed them, so they didn't accidentally sail off the wrong side of a continent that wasn't supposed to be there. So you, the cartographer, had to take these fragmented, often contradictory pieces of information and somehow stitch them together onto a flat surface, ideally using the respected but increasingly outdated framework you learned from Ptolemy. This is where the distortions crept in, not just from the inherent difficulty of putting a sphere onto a flat sheet, which is a whole mathematical headache we can maybe snooze through later, but from the data itself. You'd have two captains returning from the Caribbean, one saying an island was here, the other saying it was there perhaps because of errors in their measurements or just misidentification. What do? You might average their positions or perhaps favor the report from the captain who paid you better. Hey, cartographers gotta eat. Or you might just draw the island as a blob covering both reported spots, hoping no one notices you fudged it a little. Sometimes map makers would deliberately elongate or compress features to make them fit the existing grid, or to connect a newly discovered coastline to a known one based on pure speculation. If a sailor reported sailing north along a new coast for 1,000 miles but didn't find its end, the cartographer might just assume it connected to Asia or North America based on theoretical geography, and draw a tidy line doing just that, even with zero evidence. It was like drawing a path on a treasure map before you've actually found the treasure. A hopeful guess. One common distortion stemming from this lack of precise longitudinal data was the stretching or squishing of land masses east to west. While latitude distance north or south of the equator could be measured relatively accurately using celestial observations like the height of the sun or pole star longitude east or west, was a nightmare at sea in the 1500s. Without accurate clocks, they didn't exist yet in a practical form. For ships, determining longitude was largely impossible. You basically knew how far north or south you were, but had to guess how far east or west you traveled based on speed and direction, which currents and wind made incredibly unreliable. This meant coastlines reported by explorers were solid vertically, but incredibly rubbery horizontally, leading to continents being drawn too wide, too narrow, or weirdly curved depending on the voyage data used. A mainstream historical fact highlighting this challenge is that despite the explosion of exploration in the early 1500s, major coastal features, especially in places like the Pacific coast of North America or the southern tip of South America, remained wildly inaccurate on maps for decades. The Strait of Magellan, though, found relatively early 1520, was often drawn incorrectly, leading to ships getting lost or wrecked trying to navigate it. The sheer difficulty of surveying accurately meant maps lagged far behind the initial discovery. A quirky tidbit often seen on maps of this era is the inclusion of speculative rivers or mountain ranges stretching into the unknown interior of continents. If an explorer reported seeing mountains far inland or hearing tales of a great river, map makers lacking any detailed survey might draw a massive sprawling river system or an imposing mountain chain, sometimes labeling them with hopeful names like River of Silver or Mountains of Gold, based purely on rumor or desire. These weren't just artistic flourishes. They were attempts to fill the void of knowledge with plausible or wishful geographic features, making the map look more complete and perhaps encouraging future exploration in that direction. It's like when you're drawing a map of your neighborhood as a kid and put a giant cool treehouse in your backyard, even though it's totally not there. Historians still argue whether the rapid filling of maps with speculative geography like those phantom mountains or connecting rivers was primarily driven by genuine scientific curiosity and the desire to create a complete picture of the world, or if it was largely fueled by economic motives, trying to draw routes to perceived riches or connecting known resources to navigable waterways. Was it the pursuit of knowledge or the pursuit of profit that pushed cartographers to take such educated or sometimes wild guesses with their ink? It's a bit like debating if you choose your next Netflix show because you genuinely love the genre or because the algorithm really wants you to watch it. Probably a mix of external pressure and internal motivation, wouldn't you say? So the map in your hands isn't just a representation of what was known. It's a fascinating blend of accurate observations for the time-educated guesses, wishful thinking, and outright errors stemming from the monumental challenge of collecting and interpreting data in an era without modern technology. It's a document of geographical uncertainty reflecting the brave, often clumsy attempts to chart a world that was stubbornly refusing to fit the old models. Every curved coastline, every misplaced island, every blank space represents a journey taken, data collected, and a cartographer scratching their head trying to make sense of it all. Often with a deadline looming and patrons demanding to see their newly claimed lands proudly displayed, even if they were drawn a bit wobbly. So you've got this map in your hands, a patchwork quilt of shaky data, educated guesses, and wishful thinking. And one of the biggest, most fascinating errors staring back at you is the colossal geographical mix-up that defined the early decades of the age of exploration, the firm, persistent belief that the lands being discovered to the west across the Atlantic were in fact the eastern edges of Asia. Yes, the Caribbean islands, the coasts of Central and South America, and later North America itself were initially slapped onto maps as extensions of India, China, and Japan. Imagine the conversation, "Hey boss, just sailed across the ocean." "Great, did you find India?" "Well, I found some islands and some coastline. Looks a bit different from the pictures." "Perfect, that's definitely the Indies. Just the eastern bit, maybe a bit lumpy." That sounds ridiculous to us now with our global satellite views and accurate maps. But in the 1500s, this was the working theory baked into the very lines and labels of maps like the one you're examining. This wasn't just a simple case of oops, wrong turn. It stemmed from a deep-seated geographical understanding inherited from antiquity, primarily through the work of Claudius Ptolemy, a 2nd century Greek-Roman scholar. His geography, rediscovered and translated into Latin in the 15th century, provided the framework for European cartography. Ptolemy had a fairly accurate understanding of the known world Europe, Asia, Africa, but significantly underestimated the circumference of the Earth and overestimated the eastward extent of the Asian continent. He also believed there was no vast ocean between Western Europe and Eastern Asia, or at least not one that couldn't be easily sailed across. Enter Christopher Columbus. He devoured classical texts, including Ptolemy, and became convinced he could reach the lucrative markets of the East Cathay, Josh, China, and Chipangu, Japan, by sailing west across the Atlantic. His calculations of the distance were wildly optimistic based on an even smaller Earth circumference than Ptolemy's already small figure and an even larger eastward extent of Asia. When he made landfall in the Bahamas in 1492, it perfectly matched his expectations of reaching the outlying islands of the Indies, or perhaps Chipangu itself. He wasn't looking for a new continent, he was looking for a shortcut to a known one. And the maps reflected this. Early maps like Juan de la Cosa's famous 1500 Mappa Mundi, one of the earliest European maps to show parts of the New World, show Cuba clearly labeled as part of mainland Asia, with a large landmass to the south, depicted but not yet connected, hinting at something else but still within the Asian sphere. The Caribbean islands were labeled Antilles, a name linked to legendary islands of the Atlantic, but firmly placed near the purported location of Chipangu, Japan. Look closely at the labels on your map in the area we now know as Central or South America. You might see place names drawn from Marco Polo's travels in Asia, transplanted onto Caribbean islands or coastal regions. You might see areas labeled India Superior or Tierra de Parija, Parija being a region Marco Polo described in Asia, applied to coasts in Venezuela or Colombia. This wasn't ignorance of the new lands. It was an interpretation of the new lands through the lens of the Old World Order. They were fitting the new pieces into the old puzzle box. The consequences of this misconception were profound. Explorers weren't primarily trying to explore a new continent. They were desperately seeking a passage through or around this landmass they believed was Asia, looking for the mythical strait that would lead them to the true spice-rich markets of the Orient. This relentless search for a westward passage shaped the exploration of both North and South America for decades. The search for the Northwest Passage and the Southwest Passage wasn't about bypassing a new world. It was about getting through what they thought was the eastern barrier of the Old World. This belief also led to some genuinely bizarre features appearing on maps. Because sailors reported continuous coastlines stretching north and south, mapmakers started connecting these coasts, assuming they were extensions of Asia. But where did Asia end, and how did you get through it to the other side? Lacking definitive proof of a Western Ocean beyond this landmass, some maps depicted a narrow isthmus connecting North and South America to Asia, or showed vast speculative inland seas or rivers that were supposed to offer routes through the continent. One of the most famous examples of this speculative geography, born from the America as Asia confusion, is the phantom Sea of China, sometimes depicted as a vast inland body of water on the North American continent. This idea gained traction partly from reports by explorers like Giovanni da Verrazzano in 1524. While exploring the outer banks of North Carolina, Verrazzano saw what he believed was a large sea. It was actually the Pamlico Sound, and concluded that this must be the entrance to the Pacific Ocean, the Sea of China, lying just beyond a narrow strip of land. The Outer Banks. Verrazzano's report, combined with the prevailing belief that Asia was just beyond the new lands, led many mapmakers to include this Verrazzano Sea on their maps for years. It appeared as a huge inlet from the west, almost cutting North America in half, offering a tantalizing, albeit entirely fictitious, route to Asia. It was a map feature born purely out of hope misinterpretation and the powerful narrative of the time. You can almost hear the mapmaker sighing, okay, if it's Asia there, must be a sea route somewhere here. Let's just draw one in. Hopefully someone finds it eventually. It's like drawing a secret passage on a floor plan of your house because you really want one. A mainstream historical fact underscoring this is that it wasn't until Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation completed in 1522, though he died en route, that Europeans definitively proved the existence of a vast ocean, the Pacific, between the Americas and Asia. Even after this, it took a significant amount of time for the cartographic world to fully accept that these lands were not just inconveniently large islands off the coast of Asia, but an entirely separate continental system. The shift in perspective was slow and resisted, partly because admitting it was a new world meant the initial goal, finding a faster route to the known wealth of Asia, had failed. A quirky or fringe tidbit you might find on some maps of this period, reflecting the Asia-centric view, is the depiction of Asian flora-fauna, or even people in regions of the Americas. Mapmakers trying to populate the unknown territories sometimes cribbed illustrations from accounts of Marco Polo or other travelers to the east. You might see camels, elephants, unlikely to be found in the Caribbean last time I checked, or people in vaguely oriental dress decorating the cartouches or empty spaces of the American coasts, reinforcing the idea that this was just another part of the same old world. It's like drawing penguins in the Sahara Desert because you ran out of ideas for camels. Historians still argue whether the initial misidentification of the Americas as part of Asia was primarily due to rigid adherence to classical authority, like Ptolemy, and a genuine lack of data, or if it was also heavily influenced by economic and political pressures. Did rulers and merchants want these new lands to be Asia because that's where the immense profits from the spice trade lay? Did explorers downplay evidence suggesting a new continent because their mandate was to find the Indies? Or was it simply the most logical conclusion based on limited, confusing information and the prevailing understanding of the world's geography at the time? Was it stubbornness, greed, or just honest confusion that kept America labeled East Indies for so long? It's like trying to figure out if you were late for work because the traffic was bad, your alarm failed, or you just really didn't want to go. Probably a bit of everything, right? So as you trace the coastlines on this map, remember that the lines you see aren't just geographic representations. They are lines of interpretation shaped by centuries of scholarship, the ambitions of empires, the limited tools of navigators, and the sheer cognitive challenge of processing totally unexpected information. This map shows America, but it believes it's showing Asia. And that fundamental misunderstanding is etched into its very being, leading to errors, speculation, and a long drawn-out process of geographical enlightenment that unfolded section by section, coastline by coastline, for decades after those first Atlantic crossings. It's not just a map of the world, it's a map of a world struggling to comprehend itself. So you're looking at a map grappling with its own identity crisis. It thinks. It's showing the easternmost reaches of the known world, but it's slowly, awkwardly starting to incorporate evidence that screams, wait a minute, this ain't China? The process of the Americas shedding their East Indies disguise and emerging as a distinct new world was messy, contentious, and played out directly on these maps. It wasn't a sudden eureka moment. It was more like trying to convince your stubborn uncle that dinosaurs were real and not just oversized lizards the government invented. Remember how Columbus was convinced he'd found the Indies? Well, other sailors and explorers quickly followed, probing the coastlines from Brazil northwards, reporting vast stretches of land-massive rivers, unlike anything in Europe or Asia, and diverse populations that didn't quite fit the descriptions of Cathay or Cipangu. The distances involved the sheer scale of the landmass and the presence of another vast ocean. The Pacific beyond this landmass all started to accumulate as evidence against the Asia theory. One figure stands out in championing the idea that this was something entirely new, Amerigo Vespucci. A Florentine navigator and explorer, Vespucci participated in several voyages along the coast of South America, starting in the late 1490s. Unlike Columbus, who died still believing he'd reached the East Indies, Vespucci became convinced that the vast continent he was exploring was not connected to Asia at all, but was a separate landmass previously unknown to Europeans, or at least to the literate elite who wrote the histories and drew the maps. His letters, particularly one titled Mundus Novus. New World circulated widely in Europe in the early 16th century. In these letters, Vespucci vividly described the lands and peoples he encountered, explicitly arguing that this was a new world, or fourth part of the Earth, distinct from Europe, Asia, and Africa. His writings were popular and influential, capturing the imagination of scholars and mapmakers. It helped that he was a good writer, and shall we say, not shy about promoting his own role in these discoveries. Imagine if travel bloggers existed in the 1500s. Vespucci would have had millions of followers. This mainstream historical fact, that Amerigo Vespucci's writings were pivotal in promoting the concept of a new world, led directly to a major cartographic shift. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller, working with a group of scholars in Saint-Dié-de-Vosges, produced a groundbreaking map called the Universalis Cosmographia, inspired by Vespucci's Mundus Novus. Waldseemüller decided to label this new continent America in honor of Amerigo Vespucci, using the feminized Latin form of his first name. Look at your map again. If it was made after 1507, there's a chance you might see the name America or something similar appearing on the southern continent. South America was recognized as a continuous landmass earlier than North America. If it's an earlier map, it might still be labeled as India Superior, or Terra Incognita, or have other confusing names. The gradual appearance of America is a direct marker of this conceptual shift. The naming of America after Vespucci is itself a quirky or fringe tidbit when you consider the context. Columbus, the guy who first made landfall and essentially kick-started the whole thing from a European perspective, gets a country here and there, Columbia, the District of Columbia, and a holiday that's now a bit controversial, but Vespucci gets the entire continental system named after him. It's like your friend finds the amazing new pizza place, but you write the first review and suddenly the place is named Dave's Pizza because your name is Dave. Columbus must have been spinning in his hypothetical watery grave. Some historians argue Waldseemüller later regretted the choice, but the name stuck. The impact of this new world concept on cartography was immense. Suddenly, mapmakers had to add a massive, entirely new landmass to their existing world maps. This wasn't just tweaking coastlines. It was adding a whole new wing onto the geographical mansion, and nobody had the blueprints. The initial depictions were incredibly speculative and often wildly inaccurate. Think of it like trying to draw a map of your neighbor's house just based on hearing snippets of conversation and seeing the roofline over your fence. Because the exploration of the Americas was piecemeal. Coastlines were charted by different expeditions at different times, often by different nations, Spain, Portugal, France, England, etc. With varying degrees of accuracy and secrecy, compiling this information into a single coherent map was a nightmare. Data points were scattered, contradictory, and often deliberately misleading. Navigators weren't exactly keen on sharing their hard-won knowledge with rivals. It was the ultimate data integration challenge. But instead of spreadsheets, they had handwritten logs and sketches. The resulting maps from this period are fascinating for their blend of the newly added American continents and the still dominant Old World view. The outlines of Europe, Asia, and Africa might be relatively stable, but the Americas are a chaotic explosion of guesswork. Coastlines might appear too far east, or West Islands might be misplaced, or appear as peninsulas, and inland areas were almost entirely blank or filled with purely imaginative features. Mythical cities, strange beasts, or decorative cartouches to hide the vast ignorance. Look at the interior of the American landmass on your map if it depicts any. Is it empty, or does it have mountains where there are none, lakes that don't exist, or rivers that flow the wrong way? This is the mapmaker literally drawing blind, trying to fill in the vast unknown based on fragmented reports or just artistic license. It's like when you lose something under the sofa and just randomly start poking around with a stick hoping to hit it. The process of accurately charting the Americas took centuries. Early maps show distorted shapes. South America might be squatter or longer than it is. North America might stretch endlessly north or west, its western coast an absolute mystery. The Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, being relatively well sailed early on, might appear somewhat recognizable, but move north along the Atlantic coast or anywhere into the interior, and the map dissolves into speculation. This era also highlights a key open scholarly debate phrase regarding mapmaking. Historians still argue whether the rapid integration of the Americas onto maps prioritized scientific accuracy based on available data, or if it was primarily driven by the political and economic imperatives of the European powers claiming these lands. Were mapmakers trying their best with limited information, or were they pressured to depict territories in ways that supported national claims, potential trade routes, or the allure of riches like gold and silver? Was the primary goal truth or territory? It's like trying to decide if a company's annual report is a precise financial statement or a carefully crafted marketing document designed to impress investors. Probably a bit of both, depending on who was drawing and who was paying. The challenges weren't just about shape and location. Remember the scale and projection problems we talked about. Now apply that to a landmass whose size you couldn't possibly comprehend yet. Early explorers thought the Americas were much narrower than they are. The sheer distance across the North American continent to the Pacific remained a mystery for centuries, leading to persistent, incorrect notions about the proximity of the two oceans. So as the America concept solidified, mapmakers faced a monumental task, creating a cartographic representation of a vast, unexpected, and mostly unknown part of the world, using unreliable data, conflicting reports, and the limited techniques available in the 1500s. Every line drawn, every name added, was a step in a slow global process of geographical discovery and representation. This map you hold isn't just a static image. It's a snapshot of a world in the middle of a massive, mind-bending update, a world trying to figure out where it just put this enormous new thing it found. It's like discovering you have an extra room in your house you never knew about, and now you have to figure out what it is and where it fits into the overall floor plan. And maybe there's a badger living in it. All right, so you've got this sprawling new landmass crudely sketched onto your map, labeled America, or something equally tentative, sitting awkwardly beside the familiar shapes of the old world. But putting a label on it is one thing. Actually knowing what those coastlines look like was another challenge entirely. Imagine trying to draw the exact shape of an enormous, very lumpy potato while only being allowed to touch its edge in random, disconnected spots, sometimes in the dark, and frequently while being chased by people who also want to touch the potato. That was essentially coastal exploration in the 1500s. The goal for many of these voyages beyond just claiming land or finding treasure was mapping. Accurate maps were power. They showed where you could land, where rivers might lead inland, and critically whether there was a way through this massive obstacle to get to the incredibly valuable markets of Asia, without having to undertake the long, perilous journey around the southern tip of South America after the Magellan Strait was finally found and charted, which was a whole adventure in itself. So ships like caravels and carracks, relatively small and sturdy for their time, would hug the coastlines. This wasn't like modern surveying. It was slow, painstaking work. Sailors would peer through the mist trying to identify landmarks, oddly shaped rocks, river mouths, stands of trees. They'd drop lead weights on ropes to measure water depth, taking soundings, a vital piece of information for future ships. They'd go ashore cautiously sometimes, trading with or fighting indigenous populations, sometimes just trying to get a better vantage point or find fresh water. The process was fraught with danger. Uncharted reefs could tear the bottom out of your ship. Storms could wreck you against a rocky shore you didn't know was there. Disease could decimate your crew. Hostile natives were a constant threat in some areas. And just sheer mind-numbing boredom and scurvy were always on the menu. It makes today's GPS-guided cruising feel like cheating. As different expeditions from different European nations, primarily Spain, Portugal, France, and England, probed various parts of the coast, a patchwork of information began to emerge. The Spanish were heavily focused on the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the coasts of Central and South America where their initial conquests were happening. The Portuguese were active along the coast of Brazil. The French and English started exploring further north along the North American Atlantic seaboard, driven by the hope of finding that elusive northern passage. Compiling all this fragmented data was the cartographer's job back in Europe. They'd get reports, sketches, sometimes even rough maps from the captains. The quality and accuracy varied wildly. One captain might be a meticulous observer, another might have been drunk half the time, or more interested in finding gold than drawing straight lines. Information was often incomplete, contradictory, or deliberately vague, especially if a nation wanted to keep a potentially valuable discovery secret from its rivals. Imagine trying to assemble a massive jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing a quarter, or from a different puzzle entirely, and the rest have been drawn on by toddlers with crayons. The coastlines that appear on your map from this era reflect this chaotic input. Some well-sailed areas, like parts of the Caribbean, might look surprisingly accurate for the time. Other stretches might be wildly distorted feature bays that don't exist or just end abruptly where exploration stopped. The overall shape of the continents was slowly taking form, but the details were sketchy at best. One of the biggest drivers of this coastal exploration, particularly in the north, was the persistent, almost desperate search for a strait connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. Ever since Columbus, the dream had been a direct sea route west to Asia. While Magellan's voyage proved you could get there by going south around the Americas, a monumental feat completed in the early 1520s, that route was incredibly long, dangerous, and ice-choked. Finding a shorter northern passage became the holy grail for explorers, especially for nations like England and France, who weren't as invested in the southern Spanish-Portuguese routes. This mainstream historical fact that the search for the Northwest Passage became a dominant motive for exploring and mapping the northern coasts of North America throughout the 16th century and beyond, directly influenced the shape and details on maps. Mapmakers, fueled by hopeful and often fantastical reports, would sometimes draw in speculative passages, mythical straits, or hint at connections between rivers that didn't exist. The legendary Strait of Anian, a supposed waterway through North America to Asia, appeared on many maps based on little to no actual evidence, pure wishful thinking fueled by trade desires. Look at the northern part of North America on your map if it extends that far. Does it show any inlets or waterways that look like they might go all the way through? Are there hints of a sea beyond the land? These are potential echoes of the Strait of Anian, cartographic hopes and dreams solidified onto parchment. Explorers like Jacques Cartier, Martin Frobisher, John Davis, and later Henry Hudson spent years battling ice fog and their own crew's mutinous tendencies, pushing into bays and inlets like the Gulf of St. Lawrence or Baffin Bay, always hoping this was the entrance to the shortcut. It was like constantly checking under the sofa for a lost remote, convinced it must be there somewhere even after you've checked a dozen times. The sheer persistence of this belief, despite voyage after voyage, failing to find such a strait at lower latitudes, is almost comical in retrospect. You can picture the cartographers back home sighing and erasing yet another hopeful line they'd drawn across the continent, only to tentatively sketch in a new one based on the latest rumor or wishful interpretation of a coastline. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era of coastal mapping involves the sheer inaccuracy and potential for misinterpretation. Imagine an explorer spots a wide bay. Does it lead to a vast inland sea, a river system, the desired passage? Or is it just a bay sometimes features were exaggerated or misinterpreted based on what the explorer wanted to see? For instance, some early maps show a vast inland sea in North America that simply doesn't exist, perhaps born from confused reports of the Great Lakes or wishful thinking about easy internal navigation. Or you get islands appearing and disappearing from maps based on whether they were actually sighted or just rumored to be there. It was like playing a geographic game of telephone across an ocean, with cartographers desperately trying to understand garbled messages. This leads us neatly to another open, scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the cartographic inaccuracies and speculative features on these early maps of the Americas were primarily due to the limitations of 16th century surveying technology and the harsh conditions of exploration, or if they were sometimes deliberate distortions included for political or economic advantage, perhaps to exaggerate the size of a territory, hint at resources, or mislead rival nations about potential roads. Was it incompetence or espionage, or just a bit of creative license fueled by desperation and ink? It's hard to tell if that weird bump on the coastline is a poorly drawn peninsula or a secret cove they didn't want anyone else to know about. The exploration and mapping of the Pacific coast of the Americas lagged far behind the Atlantic side. Why? Because getting there was incredibly difficult. You either had the long, dangerous journey around South America via the Strait of Magellan, or you had to build ships on the Pacific coast after transporting materials or finding local resources, which was a massive undertaking. Consequently, the western edge of North America remained largely unknown and unmapped by Europeans, for much longer appearing as a vague, often straight line, or just dissolving into terra incognita on maps from the 1500s. If your map shows a very speculative or absent western coastline for North America that reflects this reality, think about the scale of what these early coastal maps represented. They weren't just lines on paper. They were the culmination of incredible human effort, risk, and suffering. Every bay charted, every river mouth identified, every island placed or misplaced represented weeks or months at sea, facing down storms, starvation, and the unknown. The map you're looking at holds the ghosts of those voyages, the hopes for riches, the desperation for a shortcut, and the slow, difficult, dawning understanding of the sheer scale of this new world. The process of filling in the details of the American coastlines would take centuries. The 16th century saw the broad outlines begin to firm up, but there were still massive gaps and inaccuracies. The exact shape of places like Florida, the Chesapeake Bay, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, or the complex archipelagos of the Arctic, remained subjects of confusion and misrepresentation on maps for decades. Each new voyage added a few more puzzle pieces, sometimes correcting previous errors, sometimes adding new ones. So as you trace the jagged edges of the continents on your map, imagine the small ships bumping along those shores, the lookouts squinting through the spray, the navigators hunched over their logs trying to make sense of it all. This wasn't just drawing lines. It was a fundamental reshaping of the world's perceived geography, driven by commerce, curiosity, and the enduring, slightly mad hope of finding a way through to the other side. And maybe, just maybe, they'd find some gold or spices along the way. A little something for their trouble, you know. It was a tough gig. So you've got these intrepid souls out there, bumping along coastlines, getting chased by various creatures, two-legged and four-legged, and trying to scribble down what they see between bouts of scurvy and philosophical despair about the true nature of the universe, or at least how to get a decent meal. They are essentially risking life and limb to gather raw, often messy data points. But this data isn't a neat file on a server somewhere. It's tucked away in saltwater-stained logbooks, scribbled onto loose sheets of parchment that might have also served as temporary napkins, and perhaps most often rattling around as potentially unreliable memories in the heads of returning captains and crew members. Now imagine you're a map maker back in some bustling European city. Maybe Antwerp or Lisbon, or later Amsterdam. You're sitting in your workshop, probably smelling faintly of ink varnish and whatever questionable leftovers you had for lunch. Your job is to take this jumble of information, a captain's log describing a coastline sighted from a mile out in a fog, a sketch by a second mate who might have been slightly drunk, a verbal account from a sailor who swore he saw mermaids, or maybe just manatees, who knows, and somehow transform it into a coherent, usable map. It's like trying to build a detailed model of a skyscraper using only whispered rumors and crayon drawings. The data arriving was inherently contradictory. Captain A sails along a bay and estimates it's 50 miles wide. Captain B sails into the same bay a few years later, perhaps in different weather, and estimates it's only 40. One account mentions a large river. Another visiting the same spot sees only a small creek mouth. Different navigators use different methods, measured distances in different ways, sometimes just estimating based on how long they sailed, which depends wildly on wind and currents and had varying degrees of skill, honesty, and sobriety. Trying to reconcile these conflicting reports must have felt like trying to herd particularly stubborn cats while blindfolded. The mapmaker then wasn't just a passive transcriber. They were an active interpreter, a synthesizer, and frankly, a bit of a detective. They had to weigh the evidence, decide which accounts seemed more reliable, often based on the reputation of the captain or the source, and make educated guesses to fill in the gaps. This is where the map stops being a simple representation of explored reality and starts incorporating elements of theory, belief, and sometimes pure hopeful speculation. For example, remember the persistent dream of the Northwest Passage. If a captain reported seeing a wide inlet up north, the mapmaker fueled by the economic imperative, and prevailing theories might draw it not just as a bay, but as the potential mouth of a strait hinting at a passage through. This wasn't necessarily dishonest. It was reflecting the current geographical understanding and the hopes attached to discovery. It was like drawing a question mark on the map, but making it look really promising, maybe even adding a little asterisk that whispers, "Riches this way." Perhaps the biggest challenge for the mapmaker was what wasn't known. Vast areas of the Americas remained completely unexplored by Europeans for decades, sometimes centuries. How do you represent this on a map that's supposed to depict the known world? You couldn't just leave gigantic blank spaces everywhere, could you? Well, sometimes they did, labeling it terra incognita, or unknown land, which has a wonderfully mysterious ring to it, doesn't it? Like a giant geographical shrug. But often they felt compelled to fill those blanks with something. This is where older geographical knowledge myths and even artistic flourishes came into play. They might draw theoretical mountain ranges, speculative rivers connecting distant points, or coastlines extrapolated wildly from minimal data. Sometimes they'd populate these unknown lands with illustrations of real or imagined native peoples, exotic animals like elephants in North America because why not, or fearsome monsters, sea serpents, giant kraken land-based beasts that look suspiciously like dragons from medieval bestiaries. These weren't just decorations. They represented the edge of their knowledge and the fears or fantasies attached to the unknown. Looking at these parts of the map is like peeking into the Renaissance mind, seeing where science ended and imagination began. You can almost hear the mapmaker thinking, okay, no one's been there, so let's just pop a dragon here. Adds a bit of flair, right? This process of synthesis and speculation meant that different maps of the same regions from the same era could look remarkably different. One map might show a continuous coastline, another might break it up with speculative inlets. One might have a large inland sea, another might show only rivers. These variations weren't just errors. They reflected the different data sources the mapmaker had access to, their individual interpretations, and perhaps even their national biases or the theories they subscribed to. It was less like filling in a spreadsheet and more like trying to paint a picture based on descriptions from people who've only seen different parts of the subject in varying light conditions. The map makers themselves became incredibly skilled artisans and scholars. Figures like Gerard Mercator or Abraham Ortelius weren't just drawing lines. They were compiling, analyzing, and disseminating geographical knowledge. Their workshops became central hubs for information gathering and cartographic production. A mainstream historical fact is that the city of Antwerp and later Amsterdam became the leading centers of European cartography in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, with major publishing houses producing atlases that synthesized the latest discoveries and helped spread this new, albeit imperfect, vision of the world. Owning a map from one of these famous workshops was a status symbol and probably cost a fortune. Way more than your average subscription fee, I'd wager. These map makers were also influenced by classical sources, particularly the geography of Ptolemy, a Greek scholar from the 2nd century AD. For centuries, Ptolemy's world map was the gold standard based on the limited knowledge available to him. When Europeans began exploring the Americas, they had to grapple with how this entirely new continent fit into the Ptolemaic framework. This led to early maps that sometimes tried to force the new geography into old shapes, distorting sizes and relationships. It was like trying to install a brand new operating system onto a computer from the 1980s. Things just weren't designed to fit. A quirky or fringe tidbit that often appears on these early maps relates to Phantom Islands. Based on confused sightings, optical illusions, or just pure rumor islands would appear on maps that simply didn't exist. For instance, Buss Island, supposedly sighted during a Frobisher expedition, appeared on maps for centuries and was even searched for by later explorers before being accepted as non-existent. Or the persistent myth of the island of California, initially depicted as an island separate from the North American mainland on many 16th and 17th century maps, a cartographic error that stubbornly refused to die for nearly 200 years. Imagine designing your retirement plan around buying beachfront property on an island that only existed on paper. Awkward. This whole messy process of gathering partial data and creating maps based on interpretation and speculation leads to a significant open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of mythical features and inaccurate depictions on early maps was primarily a result of genuine errors and limitations in data collection, or if these map makers were sometimes deliberately incorporating speculative elements or even mythical geography to sell more maps, appeal to patrons who believed in these myths, or reflect philosophical ideas rather than strict empirical observation. Were they trying to be accurate by the standards of the time, or were they selling a slightly embellished, more exciting version of the world? It's a bit like debating whether ancient monster drawings were based on fleeting glimpses of marine life, or just the mapmaker having a bad dream after too much cheese. The mapmaker's workshop was where the abstract idea of a continent shifted into a visual form. They took the squiggles and notes from explorers and translated them into lines of ink on parchment. They decided whether a reported mountain range was significant enough to draw how wide a gulf should be, or whether to include that rumored city of gold in the interior. Many did just in case. Their decisions based on incomplete information and their own understanding of the world shaped how people in Europe perceived these new lands. Think about the scale of this intellectual undertaking. It wasn't just drawing, it was building a new mental model of the planet piece by painstaking piece with enormous sections missing. Every time a new, more accurate report arrived, they might have to redraw significant portions of their map, erasing features that turned out not to exist and adding new ones. It was a constantly evolving work in progress, a living document of discovery, error, and human aspiration. The map you are looking at is not just a static image. It's a snapshot in time, a representation of what was believed to be true about the Americas at that specific moment, filtered through the hands and minds of the cartographers who created it. It carries the weight of all those voyages, the conflicting reports, the educated guesses, the hopeful speculations, and yes, maybe even a dragon or two just chilling out in terra incognita. It's a testament to both the incredible bravery of the explorers and the interpretive skill and sometimes wild imagination of the mapmakers, and probably required a lot of erasing. Imagine the smudges. So there you are, having just glimpsed the mapmaker hunched over their parchment, wrestling with conflicting reports and deciding whether that blurry shape in the distance was coastline or just a particularly enthusiastic cloud. They've poured their skill knowledge and maybe a little bit of hopeful speculation onto that single hand-drawn sheet. Now imagine that map, this unique creation, is finished. In the days before widespread printing, that map was a treasure. It was probably commissioned by a wealthy merchant, a prince, or the crown itself. It was unique, painstakingly drawn by hand, likely colored vibrantly, and worth a small fortune. If you wanted a copy, someone had to sit down and draw another one line by line, detail by detail. This made maps scarce, expensive, and slow to disseminate. Geographical knowledge in map form was largely confined to the elite who could afford these bespoke pieces of cartographic art. Enter the printing press. Now, Gutenberg had already done his thing with movable type back in the mid-1400s, revolutionizing the spread of text. But printing maps was a different beast. Maps weren't just lines of text. They were intricate images with fine lines, delicate curves for coastlines, symbols for mountains and rivers, and place names scattered across uneven surfaces. Initially, maps were printed from woodblocks which were carved by hand. Imagine carving an entire world map backwards into a block of wood. One slip of the knife, and you've just given California a peculiar, unintended fjord. These woodcut maps were simpler in detail, but allowed for the first attempts at mass reproduction. Later, engraving on copper plates became the dominant method for printing maps. This was a more refined technique. An artist would engrave the map onto a polished copper plate using sharp tools called burins. Ink would be applied to the plate, wiped off the surface, but remaining in the engraved lines. Then a sheet of paper, often dampened, would be pressed firmly onto the plate using a roller press, transferring the ink from the grooves onto the paper. This allowed for much finer detail than woodcuts. You could get delicate hatching for shading more precise coastlines and tinier text for place names. It was still incredibly skilled work, requiring immense patience and a steady hand. Think of it as the difference between drawing with a blunt crayon and etching with a needle. The level of detail possible jumped dramatically. The advent of copperplate engraving for maps in the 16th century was a game changer. Suddenly, it was possible to produce multiple identical copies of a map, and to do so relatively quickly compared to hand copying. Relatively quickly is key here. It was still a laborious process by our standards, but a revolution compared to the previous manual methods. Once the plate was engraved, you could print hundreds, even thousands of impressions, although the plate would wear down over time and need retouching. This shift to printing didn't just change how maps were made, it changed who could access them. While still not dirt-cheap, printed maps were significantly more affordable than manuscript versions. This meant that merchant ship captains, even those not sailing for the crown, government officials, scholars, and increasingly the educated public could acquire maps. A merchant planning a voyage to the Indies could consult a map showing known trade routes and potential new markets. A government minister could look at a map to understand the scope of newly claimed territories. University students could study geography with visual aids that were previously unavailable. The map escaped the exclusive cabinets of princes and began to appear in workshops, counting houses, and libraries. It democratized geographical knowledge in a way. The most significant impact of this widespread printing was the creation of atlases. An atlas is simply a collection of maps bound together, often with accompanying text describing the regions depicted. The concept wasn't entirely new, but printing made producing comprehensive multi-map atlases feasible. A mainstream historical fact is that the first true modern atlas, titled Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, Theater of the World, was compiled by Abraham Ortelius and first published in Antwerp in 1570. This wasn't just a collection of random maps. Ortelius systematically gathered the best available maps from various cartographers, selected and edited them, and had them engraved into uniform plates. It was a massive undertaking and a huge success. The Theatrum went through numerous editions and translations during Ortelius's lifetime, and beyond becoming the standard reference for world geography for decades. Owning an Ortelius atlas was like having the Google Earth of the late 16th century, albeit with considerably less accurate zoom. The production of these atlases solidified geographical knowledge in a way hand-drawn maps never could. When you printed hundreds or thousands of copies of the same map, that version of reality became the widely accepted one. This was fantastic when the map was accurate, spreading correct information rapidly. But here's the catch. It also meant that any errors, inaccuracies, or speculative features present on the engraved plate were reproduced exactly in every single copy. If the mapmaker had drawn California as an island, remember that quirky tidbit from Section 7, every buyer of that printed map now saw California as an island. And because it was in a reputable, widely distributed atlas, that error gained authority. It wasn't just one quirky manuscript showing an island, California. It was the map, the standard showing it. This led to the fascinating phenomenon of inherited errors. A mapmaker creating a new map might consult existing printed maps as a source, particularly for regions they had no new data on. If those existing printed maps contained errors, a phantom island, a misaligned coastline, a river flowing in the wrong direction, the new mapmaker might simply copy those features onto their plate. Why? Because it was easier than obtaining and evaluating raw, messy expedition data, and because the error appeared on respected published maps. It was like copying someone else's homework, assuming they got the answers right, only to find out later you both failed the test of geographical reality. Phantom islands like the aforementioned Bus Island or Freeland, often shown south of Iceland, persisted on printed maps for centuries precisely because they appeared in influential atlases. Explorers would even set out specifically to find these printed but non-existent places, armed with maps that were literally guiding them towards fiction. The island of California, which first appeared on printed maps in the early 17th century, became so widely accepted due to its repeated depiction in prominent atlases that it took nearly 200 years for cartographers to universally correct the error and depict California as a peninsula again. Imagine generations of sailors believing California was an island based on a mapmaker's early misunderstanding or bad data. The printing process itself, while revolutionary, had its own quirks. Maps were often printed in black ink, and then the color was added by hand afterwards. This led to variations between copies of the same map. Different colorists might use different palettes or highlight different features. It also meant that adding color was an expensive, time-consuming process, often driving up the final cost of a map or atlas. Sometimes details like place names were stamped onto the map after printing or even added by hand, leading to further inconsistencies. The map publishing houses became significant businesses. Firms in cities like Antwerp and Amsterdam employed engravers, printers, colorists, and scholars who compiled the geographical information. They weren't just artisans, they were entrepreneurs. The market for maps was growing, driven by trade exploration and intellectual curiosity. These publishers competed with each other, trying to produce the most up-to-date, accurate, or seemingly accurate and aesthetically pleasing maps. They invested heavily in copper plates and printing presses, and their success depended on selling large numbers of maps and atlases. This commercial aspect introduces an interesting dynamic and an open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the economic pressures of the burgeoning map printing industry sometimes incentivize publishers to prioritize speed of production or decorative appeal over rigorous accuracy, or if the solidification and propagation of errors through printing was simply an unavoidable consequence of the technology at the time, given the inherent limitations and inconsistencies in the available source data. Did they just print what they had access to, errors and all? Or were they sometimes willing to perpetuate known or suspected inaccuracies because it was cheaper or faster, or because a more traditional, if wrong, depiction was what the market expected? It's a bit like wondering if early newspaper editors prioritized breaking news speed over fact-checking because they had deadlines. These printed maps then became the primary visual representation of the Americas for most Europeans who would never cross the Atlantic. They shaped perceptions, fueled investment in colonial ventures, informed political claims over territory, and captured the public imagination. They were often adorned with elaborate cartouches, decorative title blocks, illustrations of ships, sea monsters, native inhabitants, and exotic animals, adding to their appeal and reinforcing the prevailing understanding and sometimes misconceptions of the New World. While the printing press allowed for unprecedented dissemination of cartographic knowledge, it also meant that the interpretations errors and even the speculative elements introduced by the mapmakers, as discussed in Section 7, became widespread and entrenched. A single mapmaker's best guess about the shape of a coastline could, through the power of print, become geographical dogma for generations. It was a double-edged sword, rapid spread of information, but also rapid spread of misinformation if the source was flawed. You were getting a map, sure, but you were also buying into a potentially very distorted view of reality. And that distortion was about to lead people down some very expensive, very frustrating rabbit holes. So with these new, widely available printed maps, the world, or at least the European understanding of it, changed. No longer was geographical knowledge locked away in royal archives or privy council chambers. Now merchants in Lisbon, bankers in Amsterdam, and even ambitious younger sons of noble families could pore over a map that showed the Americas, the routes around Africa, and the glimmer of possibility in the East Indies. You could run your finger along the imagined coastline, tracing potential harbors, speculating on distances, and dreaming of riches. These maps weren't just tools for navigation. They were engines of imagination and catalysts for action. Imagine yourself perhaps a wealthy investor in Seville. You've heard tales of gold and silver, of vast new lands across the ocean. Now you can acquire a beautiful bound atlas. Maybe one of the first editions of Ortelius, perhaps a map printed by Mercator's family later on. You lay it out on your polished oak table, the copper plate lines sharp, the hand coloring vibrant. There across the vast expanse of the Atlantic is America, often depicted as a sprawling, complex continent, sometimes divided into known regions like Peru, Mexico, and Florida, alongside vast blank spaces labeled provocatively as terra incognita, unknown land. The mere existence of these printed maps legitimized the concept of the New World. They presented it as a geographical reality, a place that could be depicted, divided, and ultimately claimed. For rulers, having maps was crucial for asserting sovereignty over newly claimed territories. A mainstream historical fact is that map-making and territorial claims became intrinsically linked. European powers used maps not just to navigate to new lands, but to visually represent their claimed dominion. Treaties dividing the world, like the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided newly discovered lands outside Europe between Spain and Portugal, along a meridian, implicitly required cartographic understanding, even if that understanding was fluid and based on limited knowledge initially. Subsequent claims were often depicted on maps, turning geographical speculation into apparent political fact on paper. The line on the map became the basis for argument and conquest in the real world. These maps also provided a framework for planning expeditions. Before, an explorer might set out based on vague reports or pure guesswork. Now they could be given a map, however flawed, that showed a target coastline, a potential river mouth, or the supposed location of a fabled city or passage. The map gave the voyage a visual objective, a line to follow, a shape to confirm or deny. If the map showed a likely strait leading through the continent to Asia, like the Northwest Passage, which remained elusive for centuries, but appeared on maps as a hopeful possibility that became the explicit goal of the expedition. If the map depicted a rich kingdom, inland expeditions would be mounted to find it. Think of it from an explorer's perspective. You're preparing for a perilous journey into the unknown. You're risking your life facing storms, disease, and potential hostility from indigenous peoples. Having a map, a piece of paper with lines and names on it, must have been incredibly reassuring. It was a tangible representation of the goal, a guide, even if it was essentially a best guess wrapped in the authority of print. It turned the terrifying void into something that had boundaries, features, and a destination. It was like getting directions from Google Maps before setting off into a wilderness area Google had never actually surveyed, but hey, it looks like there's a road there, right? The visual richness of printed maps also played a significant role in shaping European perceptions. These weren't sterile diagrams. As mentioned in the last section, they were often adorned with illustrations. Ships sailed the seas, sometimes battling mythical beasts like kraken or sea serpents. A quirky or fringe tidbit, the belief in certain sea monsters was reinforced by their depiction on maps blending myth and geography. Continents were populated with vignettes of indigenous peoples, often shown in ways that reflected European biases and understandings. Sometimes noble savages, sometimes primitive or monstrous figures. Exotic animals like elephants, camels, or strange hybrid creatures filled the interiors of unexplored lands on the map. These illustrations were not just decorative. They were part of the information being conveyed, blending factual geography with prevailing myths, rumors, and European interpretations of the other. So when someone looked at a map of the Americas, they didn't just see coastlines and rivers. They saw images of people harvesting crops, hunting strange beasts, or perhaps engaged in practices considered barbaric by European standards. They saw potential resources, perceived dangers, and visual cues that reinforced existing narratives about the New World being a place of both opportunity and wildness. The map became a condensed visual encyclopedia of European knowledge, speculation, and prejudice about distant lands. These maps fueled narratives and expectations. They contributed to the belief in the existence of El Dorado, the legendary city of gold, or the seven cities of Cibola, sparking numerous expeditions inland, based on hopeful interpretations of indigenous accounts filtered through European desires, and sometimes given provisional placement on maps. If a map hinted at a large lake in the interior, it might be assumed to be connected to a major river system leading to wealth. The map provided the visual hook, the proof that these places might exist, making it easier to gather funding and recruits for ventures to find them. The competition between European powers amplified the importance of maps. If Spain published a map showing vast territories claimed as New Spain, Portugal, or England would counter with their own maps, perhaps depicting different boundaries or highlighting areas they intended to explore and claim. The map became a tool of political propaganda, a visual assertion of power and aspiration. Owning the most accurate, comprehensive map was not just about better navigation. It was about having superior knowledge which translated directly into economic and political advantage. It was like having the best competitive intelligence in the age of sail. The printing press, by disseminating these maps widely, also created a sort of shared European consciousness about the world. Merchants in London, scholars in Paris, and administrators in Madrid were all potentially looking at variations of the same map of the Americas. This shared visual reference point, even with its inaccuracies, facilitated communication planning and competition on a continental scale. It helped shape a collective understanding of what the New World was and where the opportunities lay. However, this widespread influence also meant that the errors on the maps were just as widely disseminated and believed as the accurate information. Remember the island of California? Its depiction on influential printed maps led generations to believe it was a real geographical feature separate from the mainland. Explorers wasted time and resources searching for the strait that would separate it, convinced by the map's authority. This reliance on potentially faulty printed maps highlights an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether explorers and their sponsors in the 16th and 17th centuries were primarily motivated by the geographical information or misinformation presented on maps, or if the maps served more as post hoc justifications and planning aids for expeditions driven by economic ambition, national rivalry, or pure adventurous spirit. Essentially using the map as a blueprint they hoped was correct, but were prepared to find wasn't. Was the map the reason for the voyage, or just a tool used during it? The map then was a powerful force. It guided ships, it fueled dreams of wealth and empire, it shaped how millions of Europeans envisioned a world they would never see, and it spurred a relentless drive to explore and exploit the places it depicted. It transformed abstract concepts of distance and geography into tangible visual forms that everyone from a king to a common sailor could potentially understand and be motivated by. But relying on a map, especially one compiled from patchy, data-old rumors and pure guesswork, was a gamble. What happens when the coastline on the map turns out to be wildly different from the one you encounter? What do you do when the promised strait is nothing but an unbroken wall of land? How do you navigate when the river you expected isn't there? Or the mountain range blocks your path where the map showed flat plains? The maps were sending people into the unknown, armed with expectations that reality was about to brutally challenge. And that challenge was about to drive some people, well, a little bit mad. So you've got this beautiful detailed map. Printed authoritative, probably cost you a fortune. It shows coastlines, rivers snaking inland, maybe mountains, and hints of riches or passages. You board your ship or gather your crew for an overland trek holding this map, this promise of what lies ahead. The voyage begins, and for a while perhaps things line up. The coastline looks roughly similar. The major headlands are where the map says they are. You feel confident, secure in the knowledge this paper holds, but then things start to diverge. The river you were supposed to find is just a small stream, or worse, not there at all. The safe harbor depicted as a wide bay is actually a treacherous rocky cove. The mountains you expected far inland are looming directly on the coast, forcing you to take a much longer, more difficult route. The neat, unbroken lines on the parchment collide violently with the messy, unpredictable reality of wind waves, mud, and dense, impenetrable forest. Imagine you're searching for that fabled Northwest Passage across North America, perhaps in the cold, unforgiving north. Your map, drawn based on hopeful speculation rather than actual survey, shows a clear channel, maybe dotted with a few islands. You sail into an inlet expecting it to open up into a vast sea. Instead, you find it narrowing, becoming choked with ice floes, even in summer, or ending abruptly at a wall of land you didn't expect for hundreds of miles. You spend weeks, maybe months, pushing through ice, battling storms, running low on supplies, only to hit a dead end the map promised wouldn't be there. The crisp blue line on the map becomes a mocking reminder of your wasted effort in increasing danger. This discrepancy between the map and reality wasn't just inconvenient, it was life-threatening. Expeditions relied on maps not just for general direction, but for planning critical logistics. You might estimate the time needed for a leg of the journey based on the distances shown on the map and thus calculate how much food and water to bring. If the route turns out to be twice as long due to unexpected detours around impassable terrain, or if finding fresh water along a river proves impossible because the map was wrong about its size and flow, you're suddenly facing starvation and thirst in the middle of nowhere. You plan to sail up a wide river to a promised trading post only to find the river is shallow and choked with rapids, forcing you to abandon your ship and attempt a dangerous overland journey through unknown territory. Your map showed a smooth path. Reality gives you cliffs and tangled undergrowth. It's like planning a road trip across the country using a map from the 1800s. Sure, the continents are roughly in the right place, but try finding a gas station or avoiding a mountain range that's not marked. The sheer physical effort involved in exploration made these map failures incredibly frustrating. You've just spent days hacking through dense jungle sweat, stinging your eyes, insects buzzing around your ears, following a line on the map that indicated a relatively straight path to a lake. You finally break through the undergrowth, exhausted and bleeding from cuts and scrapes, only to find nothing. No lake, just more trees. The map was wrong. All that effort, all that risk for a phantom feature that existed only on paper. You could practically hear the map chuckling to itself. For the explorers, the map was both a guide and increasingly a source of deep anxiety and distrust. They desperately wanted to believe the map because the alternative was complete terrifying uncertainty. But repeated encounters with inaccurate coastlines, non-existent rivers, or wrongly placed settlements chipped away at that trust. Was the next feature on the map real? Or would it lead to another dead end, another wasted month, another brush with disaster? This constant verification process, the exhausting comparison of parchment to reality, was mentally draining. A mainstream historical fact is that the high mortality rate of early exploration was significantly impacted by logistical failures, often linked to inadequate maps. Expeditions ran out of food, were ambushed in terrain they didn't understand, or succumbed to diseases because the maps didn't accurately depict the environment or potential resources. For example, the numerous attempts to find a navigable passage through North America via river systems in the southeast were repeatedly foiled by rapids, waterfalls, and distances far greater than indicated on maps, leading to immense hardship and loss of life. The psychological toll must have been immense. Imagine the pressure. Your reputation, your funding, the lives of your crew, all depend on the success of this expedition, and you're relying on a tool that keeps proving unreliable. It's like being given a treasure map, sailing halfway across the world, digging where the big X is marked and just finding dirt. Repeatedly, you start to doubt everything. You doubt the map maker, you doubt your own ability to read the map. You even start to doubt the existence of the very things you were sent to find if the map keeps misrepresenting everything else. Consider the search for inland seas or vast lakes that appeared on early maps, often based on misinterpreted indigenous reports or wishful thinking. Expeditions would spend months, even years, pushing into the interior, enduring incredible hardship, chasing the promise of a large body of water that simply wasn't there, or was far smaller and in a different location than depicted. This wasn't just a geographical error. It was a fundamental misrepresentation of the entire landscape, leading explorers down routes that were physically brutal and ultimately futile. It's the historical equivalent of driving to a restaurant listed on Yelp, only to find it's actually a car wash. There's a quirky or fringe tidbit here about specific map features that drove explorers nuts. Some maps depicted a vast lake called Lake Paraíba in South America, often shown as the source of major rivers, and located near the mythical El Dorado. Numerous expeditions, including one led by Sir Walter Raleigh, were launched specifically to find this lake fueled by its presence on influential maps. They searched for years, facing disease-hostile environments and internal strife, their efforts ultimately ending in failure and ruin because the lake as depicted did not exist. The map had conjured a geographical ghost. The very act of map-making involves making choices, approximations, and filling in gaps with speculation. When that speculation was presented as fact on a printed map, it created a dangerous feedback loop. Explorers went looking for what the map showed. When they didn't find it, they were bewildered and often imperiled. Some tried to correct the maps as they went, sketching in new coastlines or river bends, but this was difficult under duress and often introduced new errors. Historians still argue whether explorers placed too much faith in these early printed maps given the inherent uncertainties of the time. Did they blindly follow the lines on the parchment even when reality screamed otherwise? Or were they constantly aware of the map's potential flaws, using it only as a rough guide while prioritizing on-the-ground observation and local knowledge when available? The psychological dynamic between the explorer and their flawed map is a complex one, a dance between desperate reliance and growing suspicion. Was the map a crutch that eventually broke, or merely a starting point that needed constant, risky revision? These map-induced failures weren't just geographical. They had profound human consequences. Crews mutinied when faced with unexpected hardship caused by a wrong turn based on the map. Leaders lost their credibility and sometimes their lives when their map-driven plans failed. Resources were squandered on chasing cartographic phantoms. The neatly drawn lines on the map were in essence setting people up for devastating disappointment and danger in the raw, untamed wilderness. The map was supposed to bring order to the unknown, but its inaccuracies often created a special kind of chaos, a frustrating, maddening clash between the ordered world of the mapmaker's table and the brutal disorder of the frontier. And this clash, well, it was about to get worse and involve a very specific, very famous example of a map feature that simply refused to die no matter how many times reality killed it. So you felt that sting of the map lying to you, the frustration of wasted effort, the chill of finding nothing where abundance was promised. You've experienced that creeping dread that maybe the entire map is built on faulty foundations. But there was one particular geographical fantasy that wasn't just a minor inaccuracy or a misjudged riverbend. Oh no. This one was a supergroup of cartographic blunders, a chart-topping hit in the world of misleading maps, and it utterly refused to leave the stage for well over a century, despite standing ovations for reality demanding its exit. We're talking, of course, about California. As an island, imagine you're in the early 1600s, setting sail for the western coast of North America. You're looking for riches, perhaps, that elusive Northwest Passage, maybe just new lands to claim. Your map, beautifully engraved, shows a long, slender strip of land, stretching north with a vast, wide strait, separating it from the rest of the continent. It looks inviting, perhaps, offering a route into the interior, or presenting a manageable coast to explore and exploit. You plan your voyage anticipating sailing up this channel, maybe finding a nice little port town nestled on the island side. The origin of this particularly stubborn error is a bit murky, like trying to read a map underwater. One popular theory traces it back to a Spanish expedition in the early 16th century, possibly Francisco de Ulloa in 1539. He sailed along the Baja California Peninsula, noting the Gulf of California. Now, if you just sail up the Gulf and don't go all the way to the northern end, where it connects to the Colorado River Delta, and let's be honest, it gets pretty shallow and delta-y up there, not exactly fun sailing. It can look like the Gulf is an open channel leading out to the north. Pair that with maybe some sketchy reports, maybe a game of cartographic telephone where peninsula became island, and bam! Suddenly you've got California detached from the mainland. Some theories suggest the initial depiction might have been more speculative, linked to the hope of finding a strait, but once it appeared on a few influential maps, it gained a life of its own. It's like a typo in your favorite recipe that everyone keeps copying. Suddenly adding a tablespoon of salt instead of a teaspoon becomes the norm. So armed with your map showing California as an island, you arrive off the coast. You see land stretching north. You look for the promised strait. You sail north expecting the mainland to be over there, gesturing vaguely eastward. But the land just keeps going on. your side. And going. And going. You hug the coast, peering eastward, looking for the gap, the channel, the promised water that separates you from the rest of North America. And you don't find it. You might sail for hundreds of miles the coastline on your port side, unbroken, stretching north like an endless wall. The strait the map promised, nowhere to be seen. This wasn't just a minor misplacement, it was a fundamental distortion of the geography. It meant your entire plan based on navigating a strait or circumnavigating an island was completely unworkable. If you were looking for the Northwest Passage, thinking this island might offer a shortcut, you quickly realized you were facing a solid continent. If you planned to sail between the island and the mainland to access the interior, you were blocked by land. Lots and lots of land. It's like planning to drive from New York to Los Angeles by taking a shortcut that involves driving through the Atlantic Ocean because your map showed a magical underwater tunnel. The attempts to find the Strait of Anian, the supposed channel separating island California from the continent, became legendary exercises in futility. Expeditions dedicated significant resources, time, and lives to searching for this cartographic ghost. Think of all those poor sailors huddled on deck, peering through the fog at an unbroken coastline map in hand, muttering, But the map says the water should be here." You can almost feel their frustration, their growing despair, as the miles stretched on and the promised strait remained stubbornly absent. They weren't just battling the elements, they were battling a piece of paper that insisted reality was wrong. Mainstream historical fact. The depiction of California as an island persisted on maps for over 150 years, from the early 17th century until well into the 18th century, even after multiple explorers had charted the Gulf of California to its northern end and confirmed Baja California was a peninsula. This cartographic error is one of the most famous and longest lived in history. It wasn't just a few rogue maps. Prominent map makers in Europe, including the highly respected Dutch cartographers like the Bleu family, included island California on their prestigious atlases. Imagine buying a state-of-the-art expensive map of the world from the 1650s, expecting the latest geographical knowledge, only to find a major piece of land depicted incorrectly based on old information. It's the 17th century equivalent of using a GPS that hasn't been updated since dial-up internet and tells you to turn onto a highway that's been a shopping mall for 20 years. Why was this error so incredibly persistent? Several factors likely contributed. Firstly, mapmakers often copied from each other. If a respected mapmaker showed California as an island, others would follow suit rather than rely on potentially conflicting or less authoritative reports from explorers. Secondly, the desire for a Northwest Passage was incredibly strong, and the Strait of Anian seemed like a plausible route. Maintaining California as an island kept that hope alive on maps regardless of the physical reality encountered by those on the ground or sea. Thirdly, communication was slow. Reports from expeditions that confirmed the peninsula status might take years to reach European mapmakers, and even then they might be viewed with suspicion or discounted if they contradicted established maps. It became easier to stick with the known, albeit wrong representation than to risk being the only mapmaker to show it correctly, especially if the correct information was based on less famous voyages. There's a quirky or fringe tidbit related to Father Eusebio Kino. While not the first to confirm California was a peninsula, he provided definitive proof in the late 1600s and early 1700s through overland expeditions, including one in 1701, where he and his companions actually walked from mainland Mexico across the Colorado River Delta and looked westward, clearly seeing that Baja California was connected. He even made maps showing it correctly as a peninsula. Yet despite his detailed accounts and accurate maps, the island depiction still persisted on many European maps for decades afterward. It's like sending a selfie from the summit of a mountain and people back home still insisting you're at the bottom because the travel brochure shows the summit in a different spot. Talk about a tough crowd. Think about the expeditions launched specifically to find the Strait of Anian fueled by the maps. Sir Francis Drake, for instance, is sometimes linked to theories about searching for the strait, though whether he believed California was an island is debated. Later, Spanish expeditions certainly chased the idea. These voyages weren't just geographic surveys. They were attempts to validate or disprove a feature that existed primarily on paper. The map wasn't just a guide. It was a hypothesis that explorers were risking their lives to test. And in the case of Island California, the map's hypothesis was consistently frustratingly wrong. The psychological effect of this particular error must have been profound. You sail halfway around the world driven by the promise of a geographical feature that could change trade routes or open vast new territories, a feature clearly depicted on your map. You arrive, you search, and it's simply not there. The land is continuous, it's a betrayal by the map, a fundamental lie etched in ink. It must have bred intense skepticism, not just about California, but about the reliability of all the distant unverified features shown on maps. If they got this wrong, what else was a complete fabrication? Historians still argue whether the longevity of the California island myth on maps was primarily due to simple inertia and copying, or if there were deeper political or economic motivations at play. Did cartographers deliberately keep the strait on the map to encourage the search for a passage, perhaps hoping their nation would be the one to find it? Or were they simply overwhelmed by conflicting information and defaulted to the most widely accepted, though incorrect, representation? It's a fascinating debate about the intersection of cartography exploration and human stubbornness, or perhaps wishful thinking. The impact wasn't minor. Resources that could have been used for genuine exploration or settlement were diverted to chasing this cartographic phantom. Explorers faced unnecessary hardship and danger, following maps that depicted a non-existent geography. The island status also influenced how the region was initially perceived and approached by colonial powers. It shaped early strategies for exploration and control of the Pacific coast. The lines on the map had tangible consequences in the real world, consequences that were both costly and ultimately based on a persistent illusion. The map of California wasn't just a neutral representation. It was an active player in the history of exploration, luring people into a false reality with remarkable, infuriating tenacity. And while California as an island is perhaps the most famous example, it was far from the only feature on these early maps that proved to be more fiction than fact, leading explorers on wild goose chases into the unknown. Or perhaps to places that the map said were unknown, but actually weren't. Okay, so you've wrestled with the phantom island of California, felt the distinct lack of a promised strait, and maybe even sailed for days alongside an unbroken coastline that your map insisted had a massive channel, right there somewhere. It's exhausting, isn't it? Like searching for your keys when they were in your hand all along, except the keys are a continent-sized body of water, and the search costs a fortune in ships and lives. But here's the thing. California as an island, as persistent and frustrating as it was, wasn't the only cartographic ghost haunting the maps of this era. Oh no, these maps were like a convention of mythical creatures and imaginary places all dressed up in ink and promising riches or passages or just something interesting. If the California island was a tricky mirage, some of the other features were full-blown fantasies woven from theory, rumor, or pure hopeful speculation. One of the biggest, most seductive pieces of geographical fiction on these maps was the concept of terra australis incognita. Doesn't that just roll off the tongue, the unknown southern land? Forget a mere island. This was depicted on many world maps as a massive continent, often filling a huge chunk of the southern hemisphere. Why did map makers put a giant undiscovered landmass down there? Well, it goes back to ancient Greek ideas about symmetry. The geographer Ptolemy, whose work was rediscovered during the Renaissance and heavily influenced early modern cartography, thought that the landmasses in the northern hemisphere needed to be balanced by a large landmass in the southern hemisphere to keep the world from tipping over, or something equally sensible. If you were living several thousand years ago and didn't have satellite imagery. It was a neat philosophical idea that sounded geographically plausible in a world where most of the globe was still unexplored. So on your beautiful, expensive world map from the 16th or 17th century, there it is. A vast, dark shape in the south, often marked Terra Australis Incognita, sometimes with tantalizing hints of coast bays or even speculative mountain ranges. It was the ultimate tabula rasa, a blank slate for European ambitions and imaginations. Think of the possibilities. A whole continent untouched, waiting to be explored, settled, and exploited. Riches beyond measure. Gold spices, exotic animals, maybe even people who hadn't been corrupted by, well, whatever people in Europe thought others were corrupted by. It was the ultimate prize, the geographical equivalent of finding a hidden level in a video game that promises unlimited loot. Expeditions didn't just happen by accident. They were planned, funded, and often driven by the promises etched onto these maps. Searching for Terra Australis became a major goal for European powers, particularly the Dutch and later the English and French. Imagine setting sail south into the often treacherous waters of the Southern Ocean, battling icy gales and monstrous waves, all because a map told you there was a continent waiting. You sail for weeks, then months, peering through the mist and snow squalls, expecting to see land rising from the horizon, a shoreline stretching out before you. But often all you saw was more sea, endless gray cold sea. Occasionally explorers would stumble upon a piece of land in the south, perhaps the southern tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, or islands like New Zealand, or the west coast of what we now know is Australia. For a while, these were sometimes thought to be parts of the great southern continent. Aha! The captains might think chilling their perfectly good gin in a bucket of ice chipped off the rigging. We found it, just need to follow the coast and see how big it is. But then they'd sail around it, proving it was an island or a smaller landmass, and the search for the real massive southern continent would continue. It was like looking for a unicorn and finding a pony, then concluding the unicorn must be just over the next hill. The persistence of Terra Australis on maps wasn't just due to ancient theory. It was also fueled by scattered, often misinterpreted sightings and frankly wishful thinking. There had to be land down there, right? The world would be unbalanced otherwise. Plus, the potential rewards of being the nation that discovered and claimed a continent were immense. Prestige, resources, strategic advantage. So the lines stayed on the maps, a beacon of hope and speculation, drawing ships into some of the most dangerous seas on the planet. It's the geographical equivalent of that email promising you millions from a foreign prince. It sounds too good to be true, but hey, what if mainstream historical fact? The concept of Terra Australis Incognita as a single massive continent balancing the northern landmasses persisted on world maps until the voyages of Captain James Cook in the late 18th century. While Dutch explorers like Abel Tasman had charted parts of Australia, then often called New Holland and New Zealand in the mid-17th century, proving they weren't part of a single giant continent, the belief and depiction of a separate, huge Terra Australis further south remain. Cook's second voyage, 1772-1775, circumnavigated the globe at high southern latitudes, proving conclusively that if a southern continent existed, it had to be largely confined to the polar regions and couldn't be the vast temperate landmass depicted on earlier maps. He effectively sailed through the space where the giant Terra Australis was supposed to be replacing hopeful speculation with icy reality, i.e. Antarctica, which was sighted later. Beyond continents and large islands, these maps were also littered with smaller, more ephemeral geographical fantasies, the Phantom Islands. These were islands that appeared on maps sometimes for centuries, based on single unverified sightings, misidentified icebergs, optical illusions, or just pure legend. There was Buss Island, supposedly sighted during a Frobisher expedition in the late 16th century, and then appearing on maps of the North Atlantic for over 200 years despite repeated attempts to find it failing. Or St. Brendan's Island, a mythical island from Irish folklore sometimes placed off the coast of Africa that occasionally popped up on maps as if it were a real place that just played hide-and-seek with explorers. Imagine sailing towards a spot on your map marked as an island, maybe hoping to resupply trade, or just find a bit of solid ground after weeks at sea. You reach the coordinates, strain your eyes, and nothing. Just empty ocean, again and again. It wasn't just one island. There were dozens of these cartographic ghosts scattered across the oceans on various maps. Ferdinand Magellan even sailed along a coast in South America looking for the mythical city of the Patagonian giants. Another feature sometimes hinted at on maps based on exaggerated tales from earlier voyages. It's like using Google Maps to find a restaurant your friend swore was amazing, only to discover it's just an empty lot with a tumbleweed blowing across it. Repeatedly. A quirky or fringe tidbit about one of these phantom islands. The island of Freyland, often depicted south of Iceland, appeared on maps from the 16th to the 18th centuries. Its origin is often linked to the Zano map of 1380, a controversial map purportedly based on voyages by Venetian brothers Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, though widely considered unreliable and possibly a later fabrication. Despite its dubious origins, Freiland was included on important maps like Gerard Mercator's World Map of 1569. Explorers like Martin Frobisher even thought they had sighted it, mistakenly identifying part of Greenland, or Baffin Island. The continued belief in Freiland highlights how a single old and questionable source could perpetuate a geographical error for centuries through the simple act of copying by subsequent mapmakers. It's the cartographic equivalent of a viral piece of fake news that just keeps circulating no matter how many times it's debunked. Why did these phantom islands, non-existent continents, and misleading passages persist? Part of it was certainly the slow, unreliable nature of information flow. Reports from voyages were often partial, contradictory, or subject to misinterpretation. Mapmakers in Europe were often hundreds or thousands of miles away from the places they were depicting, relying on second, third, or fourth-hand accounts, rough sketches, and logs kept under difficult conditions. If multiple sources seemed to agree on a feature, even if the original sources were weak or misunderstood, it was more likely to appear on a map. Plus, as mentioned before, mapmakers often copied from each other, especially from prestigious or widely used atlases. Once an error got onto a respected map, it was hard to get rid of. It gained authority just by being there. There was also the element of deliberate deception or exaggeration, though that's harder to prove definitively. Did explorers sometimes claim to have seen land to get more funding for future voyages? Did mapmakers include speculative features to make their maps look more complete or exciting? Perhaps. But often it seems to have been a genuine struggle to reconcile conflicting reports and fill the vast unknown spaces of the globe. They were working with the best and often very limited information they had filtered through the lens of existing theories, hopes, and misconceptions. It was like trying to draw a detailed picture of an elephant based only on descriptions from 10 different people who each only touched one part of it in the dark. One person felt the trunk, another, the leg, another, the tail. You get the idea. The resulting drawing might look very strange indeed. Historians still argue whether the prominence given to certain speculative features, like the Strait of Anian or parts of Terra Australis, reflected genuine cartographic belief based on available evidence, or if it was more about political or economic aspirations influencing what was depicted. Were mapmakers passive recorders of information or active participants shaping perceptions and driving exploration based on national interests? It's a complex question that delves into the intent behind the lines on the map and whether they represented known reality, educated guesses, or convenient fictions. The impact of these cartographic fantasies was significant. They didn't just lead to wasted voyages and dashed hopes. They shaped the mental image of the world for generations. Students learned geography from these maps, merchants planned trade routes, and governments formulated colonial strategies based on features that didn't exist as drawn. The map wasn't just a neutral guide. It was an active player in the unfolding drama of global exploration, sometimes a helpful companion, sometimes a mischievous deceiver leading explorers down paths that led nowhere, but frustration and peril. And the deeper you looked into the details of these old maps, the more you realized that what you thought was solid geography was often a patchwork of knowns, unknowns, and enthusiastic guesswork, all waiting to be confirmed, or more often debunked by those willing to risk everything to test the lines against the waves. The journey continued map in hand towards places that might or might not be there. So you have this map, a beautiful, bewildering snapshot of a world in flux, and you're starting to see why it looks the way it does. Part of it is holding on to the old ways, trying to make new facts fit into an ancient framework. But a huge other part is the sheer messiness of how information arrived in the mapmakers' workshops. Forget satellite imagery or coordinated surveys. Your data points were literally whatever some guy who'd been at sea for months decided to scribble down or tell his patron over a tankard of ale. Imagine you're a cartographer in Antwerp or Lisbon in the mid-1500s. The latest ship is in back from the New World. You rush down to the docks hoping for charts, logs, anything concrete. What you get instead is often a tangle of conflicting stories. Captain X says the coast goes northwest for 200 leagues before turning sharply south. Captain Y, who sailed a month later, swears it was north for 300 leagues and then just vanished into mist. Sailor Z, who frankly looks a bit mad and might have been subsisting on hardtack and hope for too long, claims he saw mermaids in a mountain made entirely of gold, just inland from where Captain X landed. These weren't exactly scientific expeditions. Explorers were often driven by greed, national rivalry, or the desperate need to prove they hadn't failed. They had every incentive to exaggerate their findings, minimize their failures, and keep useful information secret from competitors. If you found a nice sheltered bay with fresh water, you weren't exactly broadcasting the coordinates on the 16th century equivalent of Twitter. You might report a bay vaguely located to get credit for discovery, but the details, those were guarded secrets. This meant map makers were often working with second-hand accounts, rumors, and information deliberately distorted for political or economic gain. They might get a rough sketch from a ship's pilot, a detailed but possibly fabricated report from a noble sponsor, or just gossip traded in the taverns frequented by sailors. Trying to synthesize all this into a coherent, accurate map was like trying to build a working car, using only descriptions of car parts given by people who'd only ever seen bicycles. A mainstream historical fact that highlights this is the persistence of mythical places on maps for decades, sometimes centuries after. Explorers had likely failed to find them, or even sailed right past where they were supposed to be. El Dorado, the city of gold, is a famous example, but there were many others: the 7 cities of Cibola, the Strait of Anian, a supposed shortcut through North America to Asia, the island of California, often depicted as a separate landmass off the west coast of North America until the 18th century. These weren't just folklore. They were often placed on maps based on vague reports or hopeful interpretations of confusing coastlines. Once an influential mapmaker included one of these features, subsequent mapmakers would often copy it, assuming the first guy must have had good reason, even if new voyages contradicted it. It was easier and safer commercially to copy a respected peer than to try and map an unknown coast from scratch based on shaky new data. The market for maps also fueled this chaos. People wanted maps of the exciting new discoveries going now. They weren't willing to wait 20 years for a proper survey. So mapmakers were under pressure to produce something that looked complete and authoritative, even if large parts of it were based on guesswork or old wives' tales. A map with blank spaces was less commercially appealing than one filled with imagined rivers, speculative mountains, and promising-sounding but non-existent cities. This created a feedback loop. Speculative features appeared on maps. Explorers went looking for them, failed to find them, and reported confusingly on their lack of success, leading mapmakers to slightly adjust the location of the mythical place rather than removing it entirely. A quirky tidbit demonstrating the sheer confusion: some early maps of North America show a vast inland sea in the middle of the continent, connected to the Atlantic and Pacific by rivers. This likely originated from explorers hearing native accounts of the Great Lakes, which are vast inland seas, but not connected in that way, and perhaps wishful thinking about finding that elusive passage through the continent. Mapmakers, eager to fill in the blanks and maybe hint at that sought-after route, just drew a giant lake covering half the continent, complete with speculative islands and coastline details. It's like drawing a swimming pool in the middle of Kansas because someone told you there was a big puddle there after it rained. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for perpetuating geographical myths on maps was genuine belief and the desire to incorporate all available, however flawed, information, or if it was largely commercial opportunism, filling the map with exciting features to make it sell better, knowing most customers wouldn't be sailing there anyway. Was it honest error compounded by reliance on authority, or a deliberate choice to prioritize marketability over accuracy? It's the cartographic equivalent of asking if that slightly dodgy-looking treasure map you bought at a yard sale is a genuine historical artifact or just some doodler's attempt to make a quick buck. Probably a bit of both. Right, the map you're examining is a product of this environment. Look closely at the coastlines that were being explored rapidly in the early 1500s. See how they are often vaguely defined, perhaps dotted with hypothetical islands or inlets that don't quite line up with modern geography. You might even spot a place name that sounds suspiciously like a legend rather than a real settlement. It's a testament to the incredible difficulty of mapping a world that was revealing itself piecemeal through the eyes of often unreliable narrators under immense pressure to deliver results, real or imagined. Every line on this map has a story behind it, and that story is often one of confusion, aspiration, and the blurry line between fact and hopeful fiction in the age of discovery. It's like your internet search history from 2005, a mix of genuine research, wild guesses, and things you really wanted to be true. So you're holding this map, this complex, contradictory document, born from ambition, rumor, genuine discovery, and pure guesswork. And now you have to use it. Imagine you're standing on the deck of a small carrack or caravel sails flapping gently in the breeze as you prepare to leave the known world behind. Your life, the lives of your crew, and the fortune of your patron rest in part on the accuracy of the lines and names etched onto this piece of parchment. It's less like having a GPS and more like having a treasure map drawn by your slightly unreliable uncle after he'd had a few too many. Good luck. Sailing with a map like this in the 1500s was an act of faith-hope and often sheer desperation. You knew intellectually that vast swaths of it were based on the flimsiest of evidence. You knew that the coastlines you were aiming for might be hundreds of miles off where they were depicted, or might not exist at all. Navigational instruments were rudimentary by modern standards. The astrolabe quadrant and cross staff could give you your latitude if the weather was clear and the ship wasn't rocking too much. But longitude was still a wild guess based on dead reckoning, essentially keeping track of your speed and direction, which was notoriously inaccurate over long distances. Adding a flawed map to this imprecise cocktail was a recipe for, well, not exactly smooth sailing. You'd set off aiming for a promising bay marked on the map, perhaps noted as having fresh water and friendly natives. Days or weeks later, after battling storms, scurvy, and the constant creak of your wooden vessel, you arrive in the general vicinity only to find nothing. No bay, no fresh water, just an unbroken, potentially hostile coastline. Or maybe you find a bay, but it looks nothing like the little drawing on the map. Is it the same place just badly drawn? Or is it a different bay entirely? Did you overshoot, undershoot? Is the map wrong? Is your navigation wrong? Spoiler alert, probably both. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was life-threatening. Missing a crucial resupply point could mean starvation or dying of thirst. Trying to navigate a poorly charted coastline could lead to running aground on unseen reefs or being trapped in treacherous currents. Imagine sailing for weeks expecting to round a certain cape that the map promises will lead you into a sheltered sea, only to find the coastline keeps going and going and going. Your crew is mutinous, your supplies are low, and the map, your only guide, seems to be lying to you. It's like planning a road trip using a map where California is an island and Colorado is labeled "Here be dragons." You're probably going to miss your exit. The pressure to find something, anything that matched the map was immense. If the map showed a river leading inland towards a potential source of gold or a passage through the continent, you were compelled to find that river. Even if the coastline you saw showed no sign of it, you might spend days or weeks searching, sending out longboats trekking short distances inland, desperate to justify the expense and risk of the voyage. This often led to explorers claiming they had found the river, or had seen, signs of the mythical city simply to secure further funding or avoid disgrace upon their return. These reports in turn would then feed back into the map-making process, perhaps slightly relocating that non-existent river or adding a speculative note about a great city inland, further cementing the myth. A mainstream historical fact illustrating this point is the repeated costly and ultimately futile search for the Strait of Anian, fueled by maps showing a clear navigable passage through North America, linking the Atlantic and Pacific, often based on misinterpretations of indigenous knowledge, wishful thinking, and vague reports. Spanish, English, and other explorers spent decades scouring the coastlines, particularly in the north. Voyages were launched specifically to find the strait. Ships were lost. Lives were sacrificed, all based on a geographical feature that simply didn't exist. The map promised a shortcut and easy route to the riches of Asia without the treacherous journey around South America, and explorers driven by this promise on paper kept looking for it in the real world. Sometimes the consequences of relying on these maps were just bizarre. Imagine arriving at a place marked as a friendly trading port only to discover the inhabitants are, shall we say, less than welcoming, because the information on the map was based on a single brief and possibly hostile encounter decades earlier, or just rumor. Or you might be told by the map to look for a mountain range shaped like a dragon's back, only to find a flat, featureless plain. It's like showing up for a blind date based on a profile picture from 20 years ago and a description written by their overly optimistic mother. Awkward and potentially dangerous. A quirky tidbit related to the use of these maps in the field is the practice of explorers physically drawing on the printed or manuscript maps they carried. As they sailed, they would add their own observations, correct perceived errors, or draw in new features they encountered. These annotated maps were incredibly valuable when they made it back to Europe, providing raw data for the next generation of maps. However, they also compounded the problem of conflicting information, as one explorer's hastily sketched coastline or note about a river might directly contradict another's, leaving the mapmaker back home to arbitrate between wildly different field reports. It was like trying to crowdsource a map update using only drawings done in the dark on a roller coaster. Historians still debate whether the constant depiction of mythical places like El Dorado or the Strait of Anian on these maps was genuinely believed by the explorers who sought them, or if it was primarily a convenient excuse and funding mechanism for broader voyages of discovery. Did they truly believe the map showed a city of gold, or did they use the promise of finding the city of gold because the map showed it to get the money and ships needed to explore an entire region, hoping to find something valuable even if it wasn't the legend? It's the difference between truly believing you'll find a unicorn in your backyard because a drawing of one is on your property deed, and using the search for the unicorn as a reason to finally clean up the garage. The voyages launched using maps like this were incredible acts of bravery and folly intertwined. They represent humanity's insatiable drive to explore, but also the danger of confusing aspiration with reality. The lines on the map weren't just geographical markers. They were spurs to action, promises of wealth, fame, and glory, even when those promises were based on faulty data or outright fiction. And the failures of these voyages the ships lost, the crews decimated, the years wasted searching for things that weren't. There were the harsh reality of trusting a map that showed the world as people hoped it was rather than how it actually was. Every dotted line, every speculative island, every misplaced river on the map you're holding represents not just a cartographic error, but potentially a desperate failed journey on the high seas. It makes you appreciate Google Maps, doesn't it? Imagine accidentally searching for Narnia and ending up in Norway. So you've wrestled with this map, felt the frustration and danger of its inaccuracies, understood the hopes and myths baked into its parchment. But the story doesn't end there, with a frustrated explorer tossing it overboard or tacking it crookedly to a tavern wall. This map and others like it didn't just guide voyages. They shaped the future of exploration and cartography, often in paradoxical ways. Their very flaws became catalysts for discovery, because while a voyage might fail to find the city of gold or the non-existent strait, it did bring back new information about coastlines, currents, indigenous populations, and resources that were there. This new hard-won data, however incomplete or contradictory, was then fed back into the ravenous maw of European mapmaking. Imagine the scene as ship returns battered and weary. The captain presents his logbook. His journals may be an annotated version of the very map you're holding, scribbled with notes like, "No bay, here only rocks," or "Friendly people traded beads for water," or "Saw a really big bird, didn't look like a chicken." These scraps of reality mixed with inevitable exaggerations and misinterpretations would then be gathered by the mapmakers back in Lisbon, Seville, or London. They'd compare notes from different voyages, try to reconcile conflicting reports, and produce a new edition of the map slightly, or sometimes significantly altered. It was like trying to assemble a puzzle where half the pieces are missing a quarter, or from a different puzzle and the rest are just drawings of pies someone made. This iterative process, driven by the constant push and pull between the static, aspirational lines on the map and the messy, unpredictable reality encountered by explorers, slowly, painstakingly began to refine the world's image. The mythical islands might shrink or move, the coastlines would become slightly more accurate, though still wildly distorted, and some of the more egregious errors would be corrected. A mainstream historical fact demonstrating this evolution is the gradual improvement of maps of the Americas throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Early maps showed a narrow South America and often depicted North America as a vast, unexplored landmass with speculative inland seas and passages. Successive voyages from explorers like Magellan Drake Hudson and countless others whose names are now lost slowly filled in the gaps, corrected the shapes, and provided more accurate relative positions, chipping away at the fantasies and replacing them with geographical fact. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but a slow grinding process of trial error and slightly less error. Despite this progress, the persistence of certain myths on maps is a quirky tidbit that highlights the map's lasting psychological influence. Features like California, depicted as an island, a belief that persisted on some maps well into the 18th century, or speculative polar landmasses, lingered for decades, sometimes centuries, even after evidence mounted against them. It's a reminder that maps aren't just objective records of the physical world. They're also cultural documents reflecting the beliefs, desires, and sometimes the stubborn refusal to let go of a good story that held sway when they were made. It's like that friend who insists Bigfoot is real because they saw a blurry photo once, and you just can't convince them otherwise, even with modern camera phone evidence. Some ideas just stick, especially if they're on a fancy printed map. The legacy of these maps also includes the very ambition they inspired. They were in a way the ultimate motivational posters of the age. By showing potential riches, easy routes, and vast unclaimed lands, which of course weren't actually unclaimed, they fueled the competitive spirit between European powers, driving further investment in shipbuilding, navigation technology, and voyages of exploration. Even if the specific details were wrong, the overall message, "There's more out there, go get it," resonated powerfully. Historians still debate whether the primary driver of exploration in this era was truly scientific curiosity to complete the world map, or if it was overwhelmingly economic and political ambition, using the map as a tool or a pretext. Did they sail because the map posed a fascinating geographical question, or because the map suggested there was gold, spices, or strategic advantage to be gained? It's the age-old question: is humanity driven by the pursuit of knowledge or the pursuit of shiny things and power? Probably a bit of both, delivered with complementary seasickness. As you look at this map now, perhaps the last whispers of its historical journey reaching your ears, you can see it not just as a flawed document, but as a powerful engine of its time. It represents a pivotal moment when humanity was grappling with the true scale and complexity of its planet, trying to fit new bewildering discoveries into old frameworks of understanding and myth. It drove explorers mad with frustration, certainly, but it also drove them forward, pushing the boundaries of the known world. One inaccurate line and one desperate voyage at a time. These maps with their dragons, mythical cities, and misplaced continents are now preserved in museums and archives, quiet relics of an era defined by daring ignorance and ambitious guesswork. They are beautiful, confusing testaments to a time when the world was still full of literal blank spaces and figurative dragons, and the simple act of drawing a line on a piece of paper could launch a journey into the terrifying unknown. They remind us that even the most authoritative-looking documents can be wildly wrong, and that the path to understanding is often paved with persistent errors and the slow, difficult work of correction. It makes you wonder what maps that we use today will look laughably inaccurate to people in the future. Probably our bus route maps on a busy Monday morning, let's be honest. Wind down starts now, and as you drift now, the faint echoes of creaking ships and rustling parchment beginning to fade. Feel the tension draining away, the maddening lines, the impossible distances, the phantom islands. Let them recede. The journey was long across stormy seas and into the uncertain corners of the map, but it's time to come home to a quiet harbor. Your mind, like the sea at dawn, is becoming calm. The challenges of navigation, the weight of impossible expectations, they are not yours to carry into the night. Release them. Feel the gentle rise and fall of your breath, steady and peaceful. The mysteries of the map, the secrets it held, and the lies it told can rest now. They are stories from a distant past, fascinating to explore for a while, but not pressing concerns for this moment. Let the images soften the edges blur. The continents, real and imagined, are settling into place within your mind, dissolving into a gentle quietude. There is only the present moment, soft and still. Allow yourself to sink deeper, heavy, and relaxed into the comfort of your space. The age of exploration is over for tonight. Sleep now, rest well. The map is put away.